It was October 1777. The most powerful army on earth, the British Crown's finest, stood trapped, starving, surrounded by mud and musket fire. Their arrogant general, who had once boasted he would crush the rebellion in a single campaign, was about to do something unthinkable. He was about to bow his head and surrender. What happened at Saratoga didn't just win a battle, it shattered a myth, shocked a continent, and pulled France into a war that would end an empire's grip on America forever. A crown drunk on power. The year was 1777, and the British Empire believed it was invincible. For over a century, Britain's red-coated armies had marched across the globe, through India's jungles, Africa's coasts, and Europe's bloodiest battlefields, and they had won. Always. The sun never set on British power, and in the grand halls of London's Parliament, the men who commanded that power were absolutely certain that a collection of American farmers, merchants, and frontier rebels had no chance against the most disciplined military force the world had ever seen. The American Revolution had been going on for 2 years now, since that April morning in 1775 when shots rang out at Lexington and Concord. And in those 2 years, the British had been embarrassed just enough to be angry, but not enough to be frightened. Washington's Continental Army had stung them here, surprised them there, but the Crown still held New York City, still commanded the seas, and still laughed at the idea that these colonial upstarts could ever truly win. But in the spring of 1777, a British general named John Burgoyne walked into Parliament with a plan so bold, so sweeping, that it was supposed to end the war once and for all. Burgoyne was not a modest man. He was a playwright, a gambler, a soldier who loved the theatre almost as much as he loved himself. His soldiers called him Gentleman Johnny, partly out of affection, partly out of mockery, because he wore the finest clothes, threw parties in the field, and spoke about the war as if it were a performance staged for his personal glory. His plan was elegant on paper. He would lead a massive army south from Canada, slicing down through the Hudson River Valley like a blade through butter. At Albany, New York, he would link up with other British forces coming from the west and from New York City. Together, they would cut the American colonies in half, separating rebellious New England from the southern colonies. Without New England's manpower, money, and fiery patriotism, the revolution would collapse. King George III loved the plan. The War Office approved it. And Gentleman Johnny sailed back to Canada with supreme confidence that by winter, he would be dining in victory. He had no idea what was waiting for him in the forests of New York. The army that laughed at wilderness. In June of 1777, General Burgoyne's army crossed from Canada into New York. It was an impressive force, nearly 8,000 professional soldiers, including German Hessian mercenaries, British regulars, Loyalist American troops, and a contingent of Native American warriors. They carried enormous quantities of supplies, heavy artillery, and all the ceremony of a European military parade. That last part would become a serious problem. The Hudson River Valley in the summer of 1777 was not a European parade ground. It was dense, tangled wilderness, thick forests with no roads, rivers that had to be crossed by hand-built bridges, and terrain that seemed designed to punish armies who moved slowly. And Burgoyne moved very, very slowly. He had brought with him 138 pieces of artillery. Heavy cannons that needed dozens of horses and teams of men to drag through the forest. His personal baggage train included a wardrobe of fine uniforms, crates of wine, cases of silverware, and a personal chef. Every mile through the wilderness required cutting down trees, building roads, hauling cannon through swamps. The Americans watched all of this with great interest. The Continental Army in this region was commanded by General Horatio Gates, a capable but cautious officer who had learned from the painful mistakes of the war's early campaigns. His second in command was the fiery, brilliant, and deeply difficult General Benedict Arnold, a man who fought like a lion and argued with everyone around him like a man possessed. As Burgoyne's army inched southward, the Americans were not idle. Farmers and militiamen from across New England began flooding into the American camps. They had heard about Burgoyne's Native American allies and the raids they had conducted on frontier settlements, including the shocking murder of Jane McCrae, a young woman engaged to a Loyalist officer, killed by warriors allied with Burgoyne's army. The story spread like wildfire across the countryside, and men who had been hesitating whether to take sides suddenly picked up their rifles and marched to join the fight. Burgoyne had committed a catastrophic mistake. He had united his enemies against him. By late summer, his army was running low on supplies. He sent a force of over 700 men, mostly Hessians, into Vermont to raid American supply depots. They ran straight into a force of New Hampshire and Vermont militiamen commanded by General John Stark, a grizzled veteran who had fought at Bunker Hill. Stark reportedly told his men before the Battle of Bennington, there are your enemies, the Redcoats and the Tories. They are ours, or this night Molly Stark sleeps a widow. The Hessians were annihilated. Over 900 British and Hessian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Burgoyne had just lost more than 10% of his entire army in a single afternoon, in a battle he hadn't even planned to fight. But Gentleman Johnny refused to turn back. His pride wouldn't allow it. The blood of Freeman's Farm. By September of 1777, Burgoyne's army crossed the Hudson River at Saratoga and began moving south toward Albany. They were hungry, tired, and shrinking in number, but they were still a formidable force. Ahead of them, on a ridge overlooking the Hudson Valley called Bemis Heights, General Horatio Gates had built an impressive defensive position. His army of Continental soldiers and militia now numbered around 12,000 men, with more arriving every day. His chief engineer, Thaddeus Kosciuszko, a brilliant Polish officer who had come to fight for American liberty, had designed the fortifications with ruthless military precision. The American position would be brutally difficult to assault head-on. But Burgoyne had no choice. He had to go through or around the American line to reach Albany. On September 19, 1777, he sent columns of troops through the woods to the west, hoping to find the American flank. What followed was the First Battle of Saratoga, known as the Battle of Freeman's Farm. The fighting erupted in a cleared farm field just north of Bemis Heights. It was savage, confusing, and brutally close-range combat. American riflemen, particularly the deadly sharpshooters of Daniel Morgan's Virginia Rifle Corps, picked off British officers with horrifying accuracy. Morgan's men had a special talent that European armies had never encountered. They could hit a man at 300 yards with a long rifle. In European warfare, you fired volleys at mass formations. Morgan's men aimed at faces. British officers fell at a shocking rate. The discipline that had carried redcoat armies across European battlefields began to crack under this kind of targeted killing. Benedict Arnold led the American counterattacks with ferocious energy, galloping his horse along the front line, rallying men by the sheer force of his personality, leading charges directly into British fire. He was everywhere at once, impossible to ignore, and under his direction the Americans held their ground and then pushed back. The British captured the farm field, technically a British victory. But they had suffered 600 casualties they could not replace, in exchange for minimal ground. The Americans lost fewer than 300 men. And at the end of the day, the American line still held. Burgoyne retreated to his camp and began frantically writing letters to General Henry Clinton in New York City, begging him to march north and relieve the pressure. Clinton's force was the army that was supposed to march up the Hudson to meet Burgoyne at Albany. Without that reinforcement, Burgoyne was on his own. For 3 weeks, the British army sat in their camp, eating their dwindling rations, watching the American forces grow larger every day, waiting for news from Clinton that never came. The woods were full of American sharpshooters. British soldiers who wandered too far from camp simply disappeared. Foraging was impossible. The horses were dying. The food was almost gone. Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne sat in his headquarters tent, drinking his remaining wine and trying to figure out how a campaign that was supposed to be a glorious triumph had become this nightmare. Bemis Heights, the hour America roared. On October 7, 1777, with no word from Clinton and his army desperate for a breakthrough, Burgoyne made one last gamble. He sent 1,500 of his best men, the elite of his remaining force, out on a reconnaissance mission to probe the American left flank. He was looking for weakness. He found a hurricane. Horatio Gates saw the British column moving and gave the order to attack. From his headquarters, the roar of battle erupted. Daniel Morgan's riflemen burst from the tree line and poured deadly fire into the British flanking force. The British soldiers, veterans of European warfare, had never faced anything like the speed and ferocity of what hit them. And then, through the smoke and chaos, came Benedict Arnold. Here is one of the great dramatic moments of the American Revolution, a moment of stunning irony. Arnold had been relieved of his command. He and General Gates had quarreled so bitterly that Gates had replaced him with another officer and essentially told Arnold to stay in his tent. Arnold was furious, humiliated, seething with rage. But when the shooting started on October 7, Benedict Arnold could not stay in his tent. Without orders, without authorization, he grabbed his horse and rode toward the sound of the guns. He burst through the American lines and immediately began taking control, rallying faltering regiments, pointing men toward weak points in the British line, charging ahead of the troops as if he was personally trying to win the battle alone. His men followed him. How could they not? This was a man who moved through gunfire like it was rain, who seemed to have no fear at all, who made everyone around him believe they could not lose. Arnold identified a critical weak point in the British defences, a redoubt, a small fortification, held by German Hessian troops. He led the charge personally. In the fighting, his horse was shot and fell on him, crushing his leg. Arnold remained in the field, being carried by his men, still shouting orders. The redoubt fell. The British line collapsed. Burgoyne's force retreated in disorder, leaving behind their dead, their wounded, and their artillery. The Second Battle of Saratoga was a decisive American victory. That night, Burgoyne ordered his army to retreat northward. They marched in the cold autumn rain, hungry and defeated, leaving their dead unburied. Gates's army followed close behind. By October 13, the British reached the heights of Saratoga, only to find they were surrounded. American forces blocked every road, every river crossing, every escape route. An American army that had now grown to nearly 20,000 men encircled Burgoyne's 5,000 exhausted survivors. Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, playwright, gambler, the general who was going to end the American Revolution, sat in his headquarters and stared at maps that offered him no options. It was over. The sword that changed the world. On October 14, 1777, Burgoyne sent a messenger to General Horatio Gates requesting terms. What followed was one of the most remarkable diplomatic moments of the war. Burgoyne had expected humiliation, a formal surrender ceremony where he would hand over his sword in disgrace. Instead, Gates offered surprisingly generous terms. Burgoyne's men could surrender under the Convention of Saratoga, meaning they would be treated as prisoners of war with full military honors, allowed to march out of their camp with flags flying, and eventually return to Britain on the condition they would not fight in America again. Gates knew what he was doing. He wanted the British to sign quickly. Word had reached him that Clinton was finally moving up the Hudson from New York. If Clinton's relief force arrived before the surrender was completed, Gates would lose his moment. The generous terms were designed to get Burgoyne to sign before rescue could arrive. On October 17, 1777, at 9 in the morning, General John Burgoyne formally surrendered. 5,895 British and Hessian soldiers stacked their arms along the banks of the Hudson River. They marched out of their camp with their bands playing and their flags raised, the last dignity they were allowed. Burgoyne rode to meet Gates and reportedly said, "The fortune of war, General Gates, has made me your prisoner." Gates replied, "I shall always be ready to bear testimony that it has not been through any fault of your excellency." Gentlemen, even in defeat and victory. But the real significance of what had just happened was already racing toward the courts of Europe. In Paris, France, the foreign minister virgins had been watching the American war with intense interest. France and Britain were ancient enemies, and the French had been quietly providing covert aid to the Americans, money, weapons, supplies, since the beginning of the war. But Louis XVI court was cautious. They didn't want to formally enter the war unless they believed America could actually win. Saratoga answered that question. When news of Burgoyne's surrender reached Paris in December 1777, it sent shockwaves through European capitals. The greatest military power in the world had just surrendered an entire army to colonial farmers. The impossible had happened. On February 6, 1778, France signed the Treaty of Alliance with the United States of America, the most consequential foreign policy decision of the 18th century. France officially recognized American independence and committed its army and navy to the American cause. Spain and the Netherlands would soon follow. The war was no longer a colonial rebellion. It had become a world war, fought across the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, the coast of Africa, and the high seas. Britain could no longer focus its full military power on suppressing the American Revolution. It had to fight everywhere at once. The redcoats who had marched so confidently into the wilderness in June of 1777 had not just lost a battle. They had broken the entire strategic calculus of British victory. The forge, what Saratoga built. The effects of Saratoga rippled through American society like a shockwave. Before Saratoga, the Continental Army was struggling. Washington's forces had been defeated at Brandywine and Germantown. Philadelphia, the seat of American government, had fallen to the British. The Continental Congress had fled. There were serious discussions among some American politicians about whether the war could be won, or whether a negotiated peace might be necessary. Saratoga killed those discussions. Across the 13 colonies, men who had been wavering rushed to enlist. The victory proved something that many people had privately doubted, that American soldiers could face the British Army in open battle and destroy it. Not just sting it, not just run away effectively, but destroy it utterly and capture its general. At Valley Forge, where Washington's army spent the brutal winter of 1777-78 in freezing Pennsylvania, the knowledge of Saratoga and the coming French alliance kept the men from completely giving up. They were starving, freezing, dying of disease in their log huts. But they knew that France was coming. They knew the war had turned. A Prussian officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge that winter and began transforming the Continental Army into a true professional fighting force, teaching them European drill and tactics that would make them formidable on any battlefield. The Americans who survived Valley Forge emerged the following spring as a genuinely different army, harder, better trained, and absolutely committed to the fight. And what of the key figures who had won at Saratoga? General Horatio Gates became a national hero overnight. The man who had accepted Burgoyne's surrender was celebrated in newspapers from Massachusetts to Georgia. His fame would briefly threaten Washington's position. There was even a scheme, known as the Conway Cabal, to replace Washington with Gates as commander-in-chief. It failed, but it shows how completely Saratoga had transformed Gates's reputation. Daniel Morgan, whose riflemen had been the deadliest weapon at Freeman's Farm, went on to become one of the most brilliant tactical commanders of the entire war, eventually delivering another stunning victory at Cowpens in 1781 that would help seal British defeat in the South. And Benedict Arnold, the hero of October 7, the man who had charged into battle without orders and won the day with sheer ferocity, would have his leg shattered and his career left in ruins by the petty jealousies of men who resented his brilliance. He would be passed over for promotion, denied credit for his victories, and eventually driven by bitterness and perceived injustice to commit the most infamous act of treason in American history: the attempted surrender of West Point to the British in 1780. History remembers Benedict Arnold as a traitor. It should also remember what he did on the bloody fields of Saratoga, fighting without orders, with a broken leg, for a country that would never give him the recognition he deserved. The ironies of history are rarely comfortable. The long shadow: why Saratoga matters now. More than 240 years after General Burgoyne stacked his army's arms along the Hudson River, it is worth asking why Saratoga matters today, beyond its role as a dramatic turning point in a long-ago war. Saratoga matters because it was proof that military power alone cannot defeat a people who are willing to fight for their own self-determination. Britain had the professional army, the financial resources, the naval supremacy, and the global empire. America had determination, resourcefulness, and the knowledge of their own terrain. The men who won at Saratoga were farmers, tradesmen, school teachers, frontier hunters. Daniel Morgan had been a teamster, a wagon driver, before the war. The sharpshooters of his Virginia Rifle Corps were backwoodsmen who had learned to shoot for survival, not for warfare. They had no military tradition, no formal training, no regimental colors stretching back centuries. What they had was a cause they believed in completely. Saratoga also matters because it redefined what the word ally means in the conduct of nations. France entered the war not out of love for American liberty. Louis XVI was an absolute monarch who had very little sympathy for revolutionary ideas, but out of calculated national interest. The French alliance with America was realpolitik in its purest form. France wanted to weaken its ancient enemy Britain, and supporting the American Revolution was the best tool available. It worked. Britain's global position was severely damaged, and France achieved its strategic goals, even as the French monarchy would be swept away by its own revolution just 12 years later, partly inspired by the American example. And Saratoga matters because of the questions it raises about leadership, pride, and the fatal blindness of power. John Burgoyne was not a stupid man. He was talented, educated, and by the standards of his time, a gifted commander. But he was blinded by his own confidence, by the assumptions of an empire that had never truly lost, by the contempt for colonial opponents that ran through British military culture like a disease. He could not believe that a collection of American farmers and frontiersmen could match his professional soldiers. Even as the evidence mounted against him, at Bennington, at Freeman's Farm, in the shrinking of his army and the silence from Clinton, he refused to abandon the plan because abandoning the plan would mean admitting he had been wrong. That kind of pride has destroyed armies and empires throughout history. At Saratoga, it destroyed Burgoyne's. The Americans who faced him were not blinded by pride. They knew exactly how dangerous their enemy was. They respected the British Army's discipline and firepower. They built their fortifications carefully, chose their ground wisely, fought defensively when they had to and offensively when the moment was right. They combined the formal military knowledge of men like Gates and Kosciuszko with the raw fighting instincts of men like Arnold and Morgan. In the end, what won at Saratoga was not just courage or strategy. It was the combination of all the things that make a people difficult to conquer: belief in their cause, knowledge of their land, flexibility in their methods, and the willingness of ordinary men and women, the farmers who fed the army, the women who nursed the wounded, the militia who marched from 100 different villages, to do what needed to be done. Britain never fully recovered the strategic initiative in the northern colonies after Saratoga. The war would grind on for 4 more years, through brutal campaigns in the south and the desperate summer of 1781. But the end point was set in the autumn woods of New York, on the day a British general looked at the American flag and understood that he could not win. On that day, a nation was forged.